Hey everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Family Guy's decline was not some unavoidable consequence of running for over 20 seasons. It was the direct result of specific creative decisions that hollowed out everything that made the show great in the first place. The characters were stripped of the traits that made them lovable and turned into meaner, flatter versions of themselves. The cutaway gags went from being a clever bonus to becoming a crutch that replaced actual storytelling. The humor shifted from sharp, intelligent comedy to lazy shock value. And the man who created the whole thing quietly stepped away, leaving his greatest creation in the hands of people who did not protect it the way he would have. Season by season, choice by choice, Family Guy went from being one of the most beloved animated comedies of all time to becoming the clearest example of what happens when a show stops caring about being good and just settles for being profitable. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The Golden Years. What made Family Guy great? Seasons 1 to 3. To understand why Family Guy gets worse every season, you first have to understand what made it so good in the first place. Because the show that exists today and the show that started back in 1999 are almost two completely different things. The characters are different, the humor is different, the heart is different, and the only way to see just how far this show has fallen is to go back to the very beginning and look at what the creators got right when they actually cared about getting it right. Family Guy was created by a guy named Seth MacFarlane. Before the show ever existed, MacFarlane was a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. While he was still in school and shortly after, he worked on cartoon shows at Hanna-Barbera, stuff like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. During that time, he made two short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a guy named Larry and his dog named Steve, and if you watch them, you can immediately tell that these two characters would later become Peter and Brian Griffin. MacFarlane took those characters, changed them up, built a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox back in May of 1998. Fox liked what they saw, gave him the green light, and Family Guy was born. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999. Right after Super Bowl 33. That is one of the best time slots you can get on television, because millions of people are already watching. And it worked. That first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers, which was a massive number. The show was set in a made-up town called Quahog, Rhode Island, and it followed the Griffin family. You had Peter, the overweight, not very smart father. Lois, his wife, a stay-at-home mom who played piano and usually tried to keep Peter from doing something stupid. Their daughter Meg, who was just a regular, unpopular teenager. Their son Chris, who was awkward and kind of clueless. The baby Stewie, who was secretly an evil genius that wanted to take over the world and kill his mother. And Brian, the family dog, who could talk, drink martinis, and was honestly the smartest one in the house. What made this setup work so well in those early seasons was that every character had a clear role, and they all balanced each other out. Peter was dumb, but he meant well. He loved his family, even when he was doing something ridiculous. There is a big difference between a character who does stupid things because he is a lovable fool, and a character who does cruel things because the writers think cruelty is funny. In seasons 1 through 3, Peter was the first one. He was a working class dad who drank beer with his friends at the bar, got into silly situations, and at the end of the day, he came home and told Lois he loved her. He was not a genius, he was not a good decision maker, but he was not a bad person either. That balance is what made him funny and likable at the same time. Then you had Brian, who served as the voice of reason. In the early seasons, Brian was smart, well-read, and a little sarcastic. He was the one who would look at whatever mess Peter had gotten into and say something dry and witty about it. He was Peter's best friend, and their dynamic was one of the best parts of the show. Brian would try to talk sense into Peter, Peter would ignore him, things would go wrong, and Brian would be there to help pick up the pieces. Brian also had his own storylines. He was a failed writer who wanted to be taken seriously. He had a thing for Lois that he kept mostly to himself. He drank a little too much, but all of these traits made him feel like a real character with actual depth. He was not perfect, and that was the point. He felt like a person you could actually know. And then there was Stewie, who in those first 3 seasons was one of the most original characters on television. Stewie was a baby. He was 1 year old, but he talked like a villain from a movie, he built weapons and machines in his bedroom, and his main goal in life was to either take over the world or kill his mother Lois. Almost every episode had some moment where Stewie was working on a new plan to get rid of her, or building some device that would help him with world domination. The humor came from the fact that this tiny baby in a diaper was talking and acting acting like a criminal mastermind, while everyone around him either could not hear him or just ignored him. Brian was one of the only characters who could understand Stewie and actually talk to him, which is how their friendship slowly started to build. But in those early seasons, Stewie was dangerous, he was unpredictable, and that made every scene with him exciting. The humor in seasons 1 through 3 was also different from what the show would later become. Yes, Family Guy always had cutaway gags. That was part of the show's identity from the start. A character would say something, the screen would cut to a short joke or a random scene, and then it would cut back to the main story. But in the early seasons, those cutaways were shorter, sharper, and they did not take over the episode. They were a bonus on top of an already solid story. The episodes had real plots. They had beginnings, middles, and endings. The cutaways added a little extra fun to the scenes without replacing the actual writing. More importantly, the early show had heart. The Griffins were a messed up family, sure, but underneath all the chaos, they loved each other. Episodes would end with Peter and Lois making up after a fight. Peter would do something dumb, realize he was wrong, and actually try to fix things. The kids annoyed each other the way real kids do, but they were not vicious about it. Even Meg, who would later become the target of some of the worst treatment in cartoon history, was just a normal teenage girl in these first 3 seasons. She was unpopular at school, she was a little boring compared to the rest of her family, but her family did not despise her. Peter did not hate his own daughter. The worst Meg got in the early days was being treated like the least interesting person in the room, which honestly is a pretty relatable experience for a lot of teenagers. The show also had a strong team behind it. The first group of writers that MacFarlane put together included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers helped shape the tone and style of those original seasons. MacFarlane himself was deeply involved in every part of the show. He was not just the creator and the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was hands-on with the writing, the animation direction, and the overall creative vision. When you watch those early episodes, you can feel that someone who cared about the show was steering it. There was a clear point of view. There was a specific sense of humor. Nothing felt random or lazy. After a strong first season that ranked number 33 in the Nielsen ratings with 12.8 million households tuning in, things started to get shaky for the show. Not because of quality, but because of Fox. During its second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m., which put it directly against Frasier on NBC. The ratings dropped. Fox then moved it again to Tuesday nights, where it got beaten by Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Fox kept shuffling the show around to different days and different time slots with little notice, and the audience had trouble keeping up. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox officially canceled Family Guy. It looked like the show was done for good. But something happened that nobody expected. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on their Adult Swim block. And they got those rights for almost nothing because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. And almost overnight, Family Guy became the highest rated show on the entire block. It dominated late night viewing against both cable and broadcast competition, and boosted Adult Swim's viewership by 239%. At the same time, the DVD sets for the first and second seasons came out, and sold over 400,000 copies, which was a huge number for a canceled cartoon. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show and telling their friends about it. A cult following was growing, and it was growing fast. This combination of massive Adult Swim ratings and strong DVD sales caught Fox's attention. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice started to reconsider. By 2004, Fox made the decision to order new episodes and bring the show back. A fourth season was set to air in 2005. Fans were thrilled. The show they loved was getting a second chance, something that almost never happens in television. When a show gets canceled, it usually stays canceled. But Family Guy had proven that its audience was loyal and passionate enough to bring it back from the dead. And that is where things get complicated. Because the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that left in 2002. The 3-year gap changed things. The writing staff had been scattered. MacFarlane himself pointed out that one effect of the show constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to bring in new writers. The tone shifted. The cutaways got longer. The characters started to change in ways that would only become more extreme as the seasons went on. The heart that held the early show together began to thin out. The Griffin family, that used to love each other despite their flaws, would slowly turn into a group of people who seemed to barely tolerate each other. But none of that had happened yet. In seasons 1 through 3, Family Guy was a genuinely clever, funny, and surprisingly warm animated comedy. It had sharp writing, original characters, and a unique style of humor that made it stand out from everything else on television. It was not trying to be The Simpsons. It was not trying to be South Park. It was doing its own thing, and millions of people connected with that. These 3 seasons are the standard that every season after them gets measured against, and it is a standard that the show would struggle to reach again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But if seasons 1 through 3 were the peak, then the revival that brought the show back from cancellation is where the first real cracks started to appear. And a lot of it has to do with what 3 years away from television did to the writing and the characters. Section 2, The Resurrection and the Shift, seasons 4 to 5. When Family Guy came back from cancellation in 2005, it was one of the biggest deals in television history. Not because the show had the highest ratings or the most awards, but because what happened to it almost never happens to any show. Getting canceled once is usually the end. Getting canceled twice is a death sentence. But Family Guy did not just survive 2 cancellations. It came back stronger than ever, at least on the surface. The ratings were huge, the hype was real, fans were celebrating. But underneath all that excitement, something had already changed. The show that came back was not exactly the same show that left. And seasons 4 and 5 are where you can start to see the earliest signs of a shift that would eventually turn Family Guy into a very different kind of comedy. The 4th season premiered on May 1st, 2005, and it was a major event for Fox. The network placed Family Guy right in the middle of their new Sunday night animation lineup called Animation Domination. The show aired alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new MacFarlane creation called American Dad. This was a packed lineup, and Family Guy was the star of it. Fox had bet big on bringing the show back, and audiences responded. The return drew strong numbers and proved that the fan base that had been built through Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales was very real. People had waited 3 years for new episodes, and they showed up. The first thing you notice about season 4 is that it looks different. The animation had changed. In the original 3 seasons, the show had a rougher, more hand-drawn feel to it. The characters moved in a looser, more natural way. Different animation studios handled different seasons. Rough Draft Studios did seasons 2 and 3, and their work had a certain energy to it that fans loved. When the show came back for season 4, the animation was cleaner and smoother, but also stiffer. The outlines were thicker, the movements were more restricted, and the whole look of the show felt more polished, but less alive. This might seem like a small thing, but animation style matters a lot in a cartoon. It affects how jokes land, how characters express themselves, and how the whole show feels. The early seasons had a scrappy, handmade quality that matched the humor. The new look was slicker, but it lost some of that charm. But animation was not the biggest change. The writing was different too, and there was a very simple reason for that. When a show gets canceled, the writers move on. They find new jobs, they go work on other shows, they start new projects. You cannot expect a team of writers to sit around for 3 years waiting for a show that might never come back. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this directly when he said that one of the effects of Family Guy constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to restaff writers. So when the show returned in 2005, it was not the same writing room that had crafted those beloved first 3 seasons. Some of the original writers were gone, new writers had come in, and while new writers are not automatically a bad thing, it does mean that the tone of the show was going to shift, because different people bring different sensibilities to the table. One of the most noticeable changes in season 4 was the cutaway gags. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways were a part of the show, but they did not dominate it. They were like seasoning on a meal, a little bit here and there to add some flavor. But starting in season 4, the cutaways became more frequent, longer, and more central to the comedy. Episodes started to lean on them harder. Instead of the cutaways being a bonus on top of a good story, they started to feel like the main attraction, with the actual plot just being something that connected one cutaway to the next. Now, to be fair, many of these cutaways were still funny. Some of the most iconic and most shared Family Guy clips on the internet come from this era. These self-contained little sketches were perfect for the rise of video sharing websites like YouTube, which launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back. Fans could clip out a 30-second cutaway, upload it, and it would get millions of views. This made Family Guy one of the most viral shows on the internet during this period. But there is a difference between a show that creates great moments and a show that tells great stories. And Family Guy was slowly starting to become more about the moments than the stories. Season 4 also brought some changes to the characters, though these changes were still subtle at this point. Peter was still mostly likable. He was still the dumb but lovable dad who got into trouble and usually learned some kind of lesson by the end of the episode. But there were moments where his stupidity was pushed a little further than it had been before. In the original seasons, Peter was dumb in a way that felt grounded. He made bad decisions because he did not think things through, not because he was incapable of basic human reasoning. Starting in season 4, his intelligence began to drop even lower. He started doing things that were not just foolish, but genuinely harmful, and the show did not always hold him accountable for it the way the earlier seasons would have. Brian was still mostly the voice of reason in season 4, but there were small hints of what he would become later. His liberal political views, which had always been part of his character, started to show up more often and more directly. In the original run, Brian having opinions was just one part of who he was. He was also a failed writer, a bit of a drinker, unlucky in love, and a loyal friend to Peter. But after the revival, the political side of Brian began to take up more space. It was not overwhelming yet, not in seasons 4 and 5, but you could feel it building. The character who used to be the grounded, sarcastic heart of the show was starting to become something else. Stewie's transformation was more obvious. In the original 3 seasons, Stewie was the evil baby. That was his whole thing. He wanted to kill Lois, he wanted to take over the world, he built laser guns and time machines and mind control devices. He talked like a British villain, and he was one of the most unique characters in all of animation. But the writers, including MacFarlane, had started to feel like the evil baby routine was getting old. They felt they had taken that joke as far as it could go. So starting in season 4, they began shifting Stewie away from his villainous personality. The world domination plots became less frequent. The attempts to kill Lois slowed down. Instead, Stewie started showing more of his softer, more emotional side. He became closer with Brian. He started having storylines that were less about evil schemes and more about his personal insecurities, his identity, and his relationships. By the end of season 5, the Stewie you were watching was already very different from the Stewie of season 1. Now, to be fair, some of this worked. The developing friendship between Stewie and Brian became one of the most popular aspects of the show. Their dynamic was different from the Peter and Brian friendship. Brian did not need to be Stewie's voice of reason because Stewie did not need one. Instead, they became more like an odd couple, 2 very different personalities who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Episodes that focused on the 2 of them going on adventures together were often the highlights of these seasons. But the trade-off was that the show lost something truly original. There were hundreds of cartoon characters who were funny sidekicks or quirky best friends. There was only one evil genius baby who wanted to murder his mother and conquer the planet. That character was being slowly retired, and nothing quite as special was taking his place. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued the trends that Season 4 had started. The cutaways kept growing, the characters kept shifting, but this season also produced some episodes that are genuinely considered among the best the show has ever made. The season premiere, Stewie Loves Lois, showed a completely different side of the Stewie and Lois relationship and was praised by fans and critics. Road to Rupert, which featured Brian and Stewie on one of their signature road trip adventures, was another standout. Barely Legal, where Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity, showed that the show could still write sharp, character-driven comedy when it wanted to. These episodes proved that the talent was still there. The writers could still deliver when they were firing on all cylinders. But Season 5 also had a problem that would only get worse over time. The treatment of Meg Griffin began to escalate. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was just the boring, unpopular teenager. The joke was that she was the least interesting member of an otherwise crazy family. But starting in Season 4 and getting worse in Season 5, the jokes about Meg shifted from her being boring to her being ugly, unwanted, and deserving of abuse. Peter started making crueler comments about her. The other characters started treating her with more open contempt. It was still relatively mild compared to what would come later, but the seeds were being planted. The show was discovering that making fun of Meg got a reaction from the audience, and it started going to that well more and more often without thinking about what it was doing to her character or what kind of humor it was creating. Another thing that changed during this period was the relationship between the family members. In the first 3 seasons, the Griffins were a dysfunctional family, but they loved each other. Episodes ended with hugs, apologies, and the understanding that no matter how badly they messed up, they were still a family. Starting with the revival, that warmth started to cool down. Peter and Lois fought more, and not in the playful way they used to. The kids were meaner to each other. The moments of genuine affection that used to close out episodes became less frequent. It was a gradual change, the kind of thing you might not notice from one episode to the next. But if you watched a season 1 episode and then jumped straight to a season 5 episode, you would feel the difference right away. The family that used to stick together no matter what was slowly becoming a family that seemed annoyed by each other's existence. Despite all of these changes, seasons 4 and 5 are still generally considered to be good television. They are not at the same level as seasons 1 through 3, but they are far above what the show would become in later years. The writing, while different, was still sharp enough to produce memorable episodes. The characters, while shifting, still had enough of their original personalities to be enjoyable. The cutaways, while more dominant, were still creative enough to get genuine laughs. If the show had stayed at this level, Family Guy would probably be remembered very differently than it is today. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But it did not stay at this level. The changes that started as small cracks in seasons 4 and 5 were about to get much bigger. And the next 2 seasons would bring a writer's strike, a major animation change, and the last real stretch of the show that fans could argue was still mostly working before the bottom started to fall out. Section 3. The Tipping Point, where the cracks begin. Seasons 6 to 7. If seasons 4 and 5 were the period where you could feel something changing, but could not quite put your finger on it, seasons 6 and 7 are where the changes become impossible to ignore. These 2 seasons are the bridge between the Family Guy that people fell in love with and the Family Guy that people started to fall out of love with. They are not terrible seasons. There are still good episodes scattered throughout both of them, but the problems that were small and manageable in seasons 4 and 5 started growing bigger and faster during this stretch, and a real-world event completely outside of the show's control made everything worse. These are the seasons where the cracks stopped being cracks and started becoming breaks. Season 6 premiered on September 23rd, 2007, and right away, fans noticed that the show looked different again. The animation for the later part of Season 6 and into Season 7 was being handled by a studio called Digital Emation. Every animated show has to send its episodes out to an animation studio to be drawn and produced, and different studios bring different qualities to the finished product. Rough Draft Studios, which had handled Seasons 2 and 3, gave the show a lively, expressive look that fans really liked. The studios that worked on seasons 4 and 5 had a cleaner but stiffer style. Digital Emation brought yet another change. The outlines on the characters became more flat. The movement was more stiff compared to earlier seasons. The overall look was competent, but it lacked the energy that the show had in its earlier years. Some episodes during this period were also handled by a studio called Yedim, which used digital drawing tablets that made the visuals cleaner, but also made the animation feel even more rigid, with characters occasionally looking slightly off from how they were supposed to look. Now, animation quality might not seem like a big deal when you are talking about why a show gets worse, but think about it this way. Comedy is all about timing, expression, and movement. When a character makes a face, the way that face is drawn affects whether the joke is funny or not. When Peter falls downstairs or crashes through a wall, the way the animation handles that moment determines whether you laugh or just watch it happen. The early seasons of Family Guy had animation that felt alive and energetic, even when it was rough around the edges. By seasons 6 and 7, the animation was technically better in some ways, but it felt less fun. The show was starting to look like a machine was making it, rather than people who were excited about what they were creating. But the animation was the smaller issue. The bigger issue was what was happening with the writing and the characters. Season 6 featured one of the most ambitious storylines the show had ever attempted. The two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie aired during this season, and it was a callback to everything that made early Stewie so compelling. In the first part, Stewie finally follows through on his lifelong goal and apparently kills Lois. In the second part, Lois turns out to be alive and comes back for revenge, leading to a massive showdown. These episodes were exciting, dramatic, and funny. They showed that when the writers really committed to a big story, they could still deliver something special. Fans loved them. Critics praise them. They are often brought up as some of the last truly great, ambitious episodes the show produced. But here is the thing about that two-parter. It ended with a twist revealing that the entire story was just a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. Everything reset back to normal. And while that twist was clever in the moment, it also said something about where the show was headed. Family Guy was becoming a show that could not commit to real consequences. Big things could happen, characters could change, the status quo could be shaken up, but at the end of the day, everything would snap back to exactly where it was before the episode started. This approach might work once or twice, but when a show does it over and over again, the audience stops caring about what happens because they know none of it matters. Why get invested in a storyline if you know the writers are just going to undo it? Season 6 also continued the transformation of Stewie that had been building since Season 4. The evil genius baby who wanted to kill Lois and take over the world was being phased out more aggressively now. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter was almost like a farewell to that version of the character. After those episodes, the world domination plots became rarer and rarer. Stewie's personality shifted further toward being more openly emotional, more interested in his friendship with Brian, and more focused on storylines involving his personal identity rather than his evil schemes. The writers had made a deliberate choice that the evil baby joke had run its course, and they were moving on. Whether you agree with that decision or not, it fundamentally changed one of the most important characters on the show, and it happened during this transitional period. Then came the event that shook not just Family Guy, but the entire television industry. In November of 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. This was a massive work stoppage where thousands of television and film writers refused to work because they were fighting for better pay, especially when it came to money from DVD sales and digital distribution. The strike lasted for about 3 months, from November 2007 to February 12, 2008, and it disrupted nearly every scripted show on television. Shows that were in the middle of their seasons suddenly ran out of new scripts. Production ground to a halt. Entire seasons were cut short. Family Guy was hit hard by this. MacFarlane was a strong supporter of the writers, and had been an advocate for the Writers Guild during the previous strike back in 2007 and 2008, just as he had been during a similar situation years before. He joined the picket lines and made it clear that he stood with the writers. But here is where things got messy. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy without MacFarlane's permission. These were episodes that had already been completed before the strike started, so Fox technically had the right to broadcast them, but airing them against the wishes of the show's creator left a bad taste. It was an early sign of the tension between MacFarlane and Fox that would only grow worse in the years to come. The strike ended on February 12, 2008, and Family Guy resumed its regular schedule, starting with the episode Back to the Woods. But the damage had been done. The strike had interrupted the creative flow of the show. It disrupted the writing process, caused delays, and added stress to a production that was already dealing with the challenges of maintaining quality over many seasons. Television writers work on tight schedules. They plan out stories weeks and months in advance. When that process gets interrupted for 3 months, you cannot just pick up where you left off as if nothing happened. The rhythm gets broken, and it takes time to get it back. Season 7 aired from 2008 to 2009, and it continued the trends that had been developing throughout the show's post-revival run. The humor was leaning more heavily on shock value than it had in the early years. In seasons 1 through 3, the show's dark humor came from clever setups and unexpected punchlines. A joke might be offensive, but it was also smart. It had layers to it. You laughed because the writing was sharp, not just because something shocking happened on screen. By season 7, more and more of the humor was coming from simply showing something extreme and hoping the audience would react. The jokes were getting broader. The subtlety that the early seasons had was fading. The show was starting to confuse being shocking with being funny, and those are not the same thing. The characters were also becoming less consistent. Peter's behavior was getting more extreme from episode to episode. In one episode, he might be a somewhat caring father. In the next, he might do something so reckless and hurtful that it would be hard to imagine the same character doing both things. Brian's political soapboxing was becoming more obvious, with entire scenes devoted to him expressing views that felt less like natural dialogue and more like the writers using him as a megaphone. Lois, who had been the patient, reasonable wife in the early seasons, was starting to show a colder, more detached personality. And Meg's treatment continued to escalate, with the family's cruelty toward her becoming more intense and more frequent. One of the episodes from Season 7 that shows where the show was heading is 420, an episode where Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in Quahog. This episode caused real-world controversy when the Venezuelan government reacted negatively to it and banned Family Guy from airing on their local networks. Venezuela's justice minister at the time cited the episode as an example of the United States promoting drug use, and cable stations in the country were warned they would be fined if they continued to air the show. Whatever you think about the episode itself, the fact that Family Guy was generating this kind of international backlash showed that the show's content was pushing further and further into territory that went beyond just being a funny cartoon about a silly family. Season 7 also gave us glimpses of what would become one of the show's worst habits in later years: the tendency to drag out jokes far past the point where they were funny. In the early seasons, if a cutaway or a gag did not land, it was over in a few seconds and the show moved on. But starting around this period, the writers began stretching jokes out for uncomfortable lengths of time. A gag that should have lasted 5 seconds would go on for 30 seconds. A scene that made its point in 10 seconds would continue for a full minute. This was the beginning of what fans would later point to as one of the clearest signs of lazy writing. When you cannot come up with enough good material to fill an episode, one option is to just make each joke last longer. It fills the time, but it does not fill it well. Despite all of these problems, seasons 6 and 7 were not awful. They were inconsistent. For every episode that felt tired or mean-spirited, there was another that showed flashes of the old magic. The Road To episodes, which featured Brian and Stewie on adventure together, were still reliably entertaining during this period. There were individual jokes and scenes that were as funny as anything the show had ever done. And the voice cast, which included MacFarlane doing multiple characters, along with Alex Borstein as Lois, Mila Kunis as Meg, and Seth Green as Chris, was still performing at a high level. The talent in front of the microphone was never the problem. The problem was what was being written for them to say. The general reception to these seasons was mixed to positive. They were not hated the way later seasons would be, but they were not loved the way the first 3 seasons were either. They existed in a middle ground where fans could still enjoy the show, but were starting to notice that something was off. The golden era was clearly over. The question was whether the show was just going through a rough patch, or whether it was heading into a real decline. Looking back now, we know the answer. Seasons 6 and 7 were not a rough patch. They were the beginning of a long downward slide. The character changes that were subtle here would become extreme in the seasons that followed. The shift from clever humor to shock value would accelerate. The warmth that the early show had would continue to drain away until it was almost completely gone. And the writer's strike had disrupted the already fragile creative ecosystem of the show in ways that would take a long time to recover from, if it ever really did recover at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. These 2 seasons are important because they represent the last time you could reasonably argue that Family Guy was still mostly working. After season 7, the general fan and critical consensus is that the show crossed a line it could not come back from. The characters stopped feeling like exaggerated versions of real people and started feeling like cartoons in the worst sense of the word. And no character illustrates this better than the man at the center of the show, Peter Griffin, whose transformation from a lovable idiot into something much darker is one of the saddest character arcs in animation history. Section 4. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin. There is a word that gets used a lot when people talk about long-running television shows, and that word is Flanderization. It comes from a character on The Simpsons named Ned Flanders. In the early seasons of The Simpsons, Ned was just a friendly, religious neighbor. He had a lot of different qualities. He was kind, he was a good father, he was patient with Homer, and his faith was just one part of who he was. But as the show went on for years and years, the writers slowly stripped away everything else about Ned until his entire personality was just being religious. That one trait took over everything. That is Flanderization. It is when a character who used to be complex and well-rounded gets reduced to just one or two extreme traits until they barely resemble who they were at the beginning. Family Guy might be the single worst example of Flanderization in the history of animated television, and no character on the show got hit harder by this than Peter Griffin himself. The transformation of Peter from the lovable, dim-witted father of seasons 1 through 3 into the cruel, dangerous, borderline psychotic version of Peter that exists from season 8 onward is one of the most dramatic character collapses any show has ever produced. It did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, piece by piece, season by season, until one day you looked at Peter Griffin and realized that the character on your screen had almost nothing in common with the character you fell in love with. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Peter was a simple man. He was overweight, he was not very smart, he worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory before later getting a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He loved beer. He loved hanging out with his friends at the Drunken Clam. He loved television and movies, especially stuff from the 1970s and 1980s. He made terrible decisions on a regular basis. But here is the key thing that made early Peter work as a character. He meant well. Underneath all the stupidity and all the bad choices, Peter loved his family. He loved Lois. He loved his kids. When he messed up, which was constantly, he would realize it by the end of the episode and try to make things right. He would apologize, he would admit he was wrong, he would hug his wife and tell her he was sorry. That cycle of messing up, learning, and making amends is what made Peter relatable and likable despite his many flaws. He was not a bad person. He was a good person who happened to be really, really dumb. Compare that to the Peter Griffin of season 8 and beyond. Starting around this point, the writers began pushing Peter's stupidity to levels that went far past anything from the early years. It was no longer that Peter made bad decisions because he did not think things through. Now Peter seemed to lack basic human understanding altogether. His intelligence dropped so far that it became hard to believe he could function in society at all, let alone hold a job and raise a family. But the bigger problem was not just that Peter got dumber. It was that he got meaner. The lovable fool who used to feel bad about hurting people turned into a character who seemed to enjoy causing harm, or at the very least, did not care at all when his actions destroyed the lives of people around him. The examples are everywhere once you start looking for them. In the episode Baby It's Cold Inside, Peter and Lois are out on a boat when Peter sees a fin coming toward them in the water. His reaction is to push Lois underneath the water and then flee in the boat, abandoning his own wife to what he thinks is a shark. It turned out to be a dolphin, but that does not change what Peter did. He shoved his wife underwater and left her to die so he could save himself. Now imagine the Peter from season 1 doing that. You cannot, because that Peter loved Lois. That Peter would have tried to protect her, even if his method was stupid and clumsy. The Peter of the later seasons does not even hesitate. He throws her under and runs. In Must Love Dogs, Peter steals Stewie's Halloween candy. This is a grown man taking candy from a baby, his own baby. And the episode even mentions that Peter used to steal candy from Chris when Chris was younger. In Internal Affairs, Peter nearly destroys Joe's marriage by convincing Joe to cheat on his wife Bonnie with another woman. Joe is supposed to be one of Peter's best friends. In the early seasons, Peter might have given Joe bad advice because he was too dumb to know better, but he would not have deliberately tried to sabotage Joe's marriage. In Pawtucket Pete, Peter gets Brian fired from being the mascot of Pawtucket Patriot Ale out of jealousy, and he almost gets away with it without any consequences. These are not the actions of a lovable idiot. These are the actions of a selfish, spiteful person who does not care about anyone but himself. The physical violence also escalated dramatically. In the early seasons, the show had cartoon violence the way most animated comedies do. Characters would get hurt in silly, exaggerated ways and be fine the next scene. That is standard for animation, and nobody had a problem with it. But in the later seasons, the violence became much more graphic and much more disturbing. Peter would be involved in scenes where people were seriously maimed or killed, and the show would play it for laughs. The injuries became more realistic and more gruesome. Characters would be shown with exposed brains, dangling eyeballs, and severe wounds that went beyond cartoon slapstick and into territory that was just unpleasant to watch. And Peter was often at the center of it, either causing the violence or being the victim of it, with the show expecting the audience to find it funny either way. One of the most telling moments in the entire series comes in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In this episode, Meg finally snaps and confronts her family about how they treat her. She turns to Peter and delivers a speech that lays out exactly what he has become. She calls him completely selfish and totally irresponsible as a father. She says he has no education and no interests, and that he just does whatever reckless thing he wants without caring about anyone else. She tells him that when he is not terrorizing the community with his impulsive behavior, he is being a total jerk to his family. She tells him he shoves his daughter's face in his rear end and passes gas on it. And she says that if someone in the outside world could see the way he treats her, he would be in jail. The thing that makes this moment so revealing is that everything Meg says is true. It is not an exaggeration. It is not her being dramatic. Every single thing she describes is something that Peter has actually done on the show. And the way Peter reacts to this speech says everything about what his character has become. He laughs. He finds it amusing. He does not feel guilt or shame or sadness. He just laughs at his own daughter telling him that he is a terrible father. The early Peter would have been hurt by those words. He might not have fully understood them, because he was never the sharpest guy, but he would have felt something. The later Peter feels nothing. Peter's relationship with his children suffered across the board, but his treatment of Meg is the most extreme example. In the first few seasons, Peter and Meg had a normal father-daughter relationship. It was not perfect. Peter sometimes ignored her or said insensitive things. But there were also moments where he showed that he cared about her. He was her dad. By the later seasons, Peter actively despised Meg. He insulted her appearance constantly. He physically harmed her for laughs. He forgot she existed. He openly wished she would go away. In one episode, the family visits a fire station, and it is revealed through a flashback that Peter and Lois tried to abandon Meg at the station when she was a baby. This is presented as a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh at the idea of parents trying to get rid of their infant daughter. That is how far Peter's character had fallen. The man who used to love his kids was now a man who tried to throw them away. What makes this especially frustrating is that the show would occasionally try to fix things. There would be episodes where Peter would realize he had been too harsh on Meg and would try to be a better father. In Peter's Sister, it is revealed that Peter's own sister bullied and abused him growing up, and that this cycle of abuse is part of why he treats Meg the way he does. Meg learns about this, and the two of them reconcile. It is a genuinely emotional moment, but then the very next episode, everything resets. Peter is back to treating Meg like garbage, as if the reconciliation never happened. This is the problem with a show that refuses to let its characters actually grow. You can have a touching episode where Peter learns a lesson, but if he forgets that lesson the following week, then it meant nothing. It was just a one-off moment designed to make the audience feel something before going right back to the status quo. Peter's friendships also changed in ways that reflected his overall decline. In the early seasons, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland were a tight group of friends who hung out at the Drunken Clam and got into adventures together. Their friendships felt real. They looked out for each other. They had each other's backs even when things went sideways. As the show went on, those friendships became more shallow and more toxic. Peter would frequently do horrible things to his friends and face no real consequences. The dynamic at the Drunken Clam went from 4 buddies who genuinely enjoyed each other's company to 4 guys who happened to sit at the same table while being increasingly awful to one another. The show's treatment of Joe Swanson is a good example of this. When Joe was introduced in season 1 in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he was the cool new neighbor that everyone in the neighborhood admired. He was in a wheelchair, but he was tough, capable, and respected. Peter was actually jealous of how popular Joe was. Over the years, Joe went from being the guy everyone looked up to being the guy everyone made fun of. His disability became a punchline instead of a character trait. His wife Bonnie fell out of love with him. His friends mocked him. Peter, who was once jealous of Joe's popularity, became one of the main people tearing Joe down. That shift in how Peter treats Joe mirrors the larger shift in who Peter is as a character. The man who was once jealous of his friend's success is now the man who kicks his friend while he is down. The overall effect of Peter's Flanderization on the show cannot be overstated. Peter is the main character. He is the center of Family Guy. When the lead character of a show becomes unlikable, it poisons everything around him. It becomes harder to root for the family when the father is a monster. It becomes harder to enjoy the humor when the jokes are coming from a place of cruelty rather than silliness. It becomes harder to care about the story when the main character has no growth, no self-awareness, and no consequences for his actions. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons is not someone you want to spend time with. He is someone you want to get away from. And for a show that was built on making people laugh and feel good, that is a devastating problem. Fans have noticed this too. People who once listed Peter as one of their favorite cartoon characters now point to him as one of the worst. The lovable dad who made you laugh because you saw a little bit of your own father in him became a character that made you uncomfortable because no real father should ever act the way he does. His Flanderization did not just damage one character. It damaged the entire show's identity. Family Guy was supposed to be about a funny family. When the head of that family becomes a cruel, selfish, dangerous person, the show stops being about a funny family and starts being about a toxic one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Peter is not the only character who went through this kind of transformation. In fact, there is one character whose decline might be even more heartbreaking, because he went from being the most intelligent and grounded member of the Griffin household to being what many fans now call the most hated character on the entire show. And that character is the family dog, Brian Griffin. Section 5. Brian Griffin. From voice of reason to the most hated dog on television. If Peter Griffin's decline was like watching a slow car crash that got worse every season, Brian Griffin's decline was like watching your smartest friend slowly turn into the worst person you know. Brian's transformation is arguably the most painful character change in the entire show because of where he started. In the beginning, Brian was the character that the audience was supposed to relate to the most. He was the normal one. He was the one who looked at all the craziness happening around him and reacted the way you or I would react. He rolled his eyes at Peter's stupidity. He offered thoughtful advice. He tried to keep things grounded when everyone else was losing their minds. He was the heart of the show in a way that no other character was. And the writers took that character and turned him into someone so arrogant, so selfish, and so hypocritical that he became one of the most disliked characters in the history of animated television. In the original 3 seasons of Family Guy, Brian was a talking dog who lived with the Griffin family. He walked on 2 legs, drank martinis, drove a car, and spoke like any other human on the show. The joke was never really about him being a dog. The joke was that he was the most intelligent and most put-together member of a family full of idiots and weirdos, and he just happened to also be a dog. Brian was well-read. He was witty. He had a dry, sarcastic sense of humor that made him the perfect counterbalance to Peter's loud stupidity. When Peter would come up with some terrible plan, Brian would be the one to point out why it was a terrible plan. When things went wrong, Brian would be the one trying to fix them. He was Peter's best friend, and their friendship was one of the strongest relationships on the show. But Brian was more than just Peter's sidekick. He had his own life and his own struggles that made him feel like a real, fully developed character. He was a failed writer who had been working on a novel for years but could never finish it. He drank a little too much. He had feelings for Lois that he kept mostly buried, but that would surface from time to time in ways that were actually touching rather than creepy. He was unlucky in love, often falling for women who were wrong for him or who did not feel the same way. He was insecure about his place in the world. He wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual, but sometimes his reach exceeded his grasp. All of these qualities made Brian feel human. He had flaws, real flaws, but they were balanced by genuine kindness, loyalty, and intelligence. You understood Brian. You rooted for him. You wanted things to work out for the dog who was trying his best in a world that did not always make it easy. The first major shift in Brian's character came after the show returned from cancellation in 2005. In seasons 4 and 5, Brian's political views, which had always been a small part of his personality, started to become a much bigger part of who he was. Brian was liberal. He was openly atheist. He had strong opinions about social issues. None of that was new, but in the early seasons, those views were just one ingredient in a character who had many different sides. After the revival, the writers began using Brian more and more as a vehicle to express their own political opinions. Entire scenes would be devoted to Brian giving speeches about whatever issue the writers wanted to address that week. He went from being a character who happened to have political views to being a political mouthpiece who happened to be a character. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's positions found it annoying because it felt less like a real person sharing his thoughts and more like the writers had broken through the screen to lecture the audience directly. But the political soapboxing was just the beginning. The bigger problem was what happened to Brian's personality underneath all the politics. The smart, thoughtful, loyal dog of the early seasons was gradually replaced by someone who was pretentious, dishonest, and shockingly cruel. The Brian of seasons 1 through 3 was genuinely intelligent. He had actually read the books he talked about. He actually cared about the people around him. The Brian of the later seasons was a fraud. He pretended to be smart, but had not actually accomplished anything. He talked about being a great writer, but his novel was terrible. He claimed to be morally superior to everyone around him, but his actual behavior was worse than most of the people he criticized. The episode that many fans point to as the moment Brian became truly unbearable is Brian Writes a Bestseller from season 9. In this episode, Stewie encourages Brian to get back into writing after years of struggling. Brian takes that encouragement and writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which becomes a massive bestseller. But instead of being grateful to Stewie for inspiring him, Brian turns into an absolute monster. He becomes arrogant beyond belief. He treats Stewie, the person who believed in him when nobody else did, with complete contempt. He lashes out at him, belittles him, and acts as though Stewie is beneath him. The episode shows Brian at his most selfish and most ungrateful. And it is hard to watch because you can still remember the Brian from the early seasons who would never have treated his best friend that way. From that point on, Brian's behavior got worse and worse. The list of terrible things he did in the later seasons is genuinely shocking when you lay it all out. He carelessly gave both Chris and Stewie herpes and then acted like it was no big deal. Keep in mind that Stewie is a baby. Brian destroyed Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert by chewing it to pieces while he was drunk, simply because he was tired of Stewie treating the bear like a real person. In one episode, Brian finds a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into the ocean. He starts to rescue her, but when he finds out she has a child and is therefore married, he lets go of the car and lets them both drown. He lets an innocent woman and her child die because she was not available for him to date. That is not dark humor. That is a character who has become genuinely evil, and the show presents it as a joke. Brian's relationships with women also became a major source of criticism. In the early seasons, Brian's love life was a source of sympathy. He was a romantic who kept getting his heart broken. You felt for him because he genuinely wanted to find love, but kept falling for the wrong people. In the later seasons, Brian became a shallow womanizer who chased after young, attractive women while ignoring anyone who did not meet his superficial standards. He would date women and then lose interest the moment something better came along. He would manipulate women to get what he wanted. He became the exact kind of person that the early Brian would have mocked and criticized. The irony was lost on nobody except, apparently, the writers. The relationship between Brian and Quagmire became one of the most talked about dynamics on the show during this period. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from season 8, Quagmire delivers a now famous speech where he tells Brian exactly why he hates him. Quagmire calls Brian out for being a phony who pretends to be an intellectual, but is actually an idiot. He calls him out for constantly hitting on Lois right in front of Peter. He calls him out for his failed writing career and his pretentious attitude. He calls him out for being a bad father who abandoned his own son. Every single thing Quagmire says in this speech is backed up by things the show has actually depicted. It is not an exaggeration. It is a brutally honest summary of what Brian has become, delivered by a character who, despite his own many flaws, can see right through Brian's act. What makes this moment so interesting is that the show clearly intended for the audience to side with Quagmire. The writers knew that Brian had become insufferable. They knew the audience was getting tired of him. So they had Quagmire say everything the viewers were thinking. But instead of using that moment as a turning point to actually fix Brian's character, the show just kept making him worse. The speech changed nothing. Brian continued to be arrogant, selfish, and hypocritical in the episodes that followed. If anything, his behavior escalated. He started deliberately antagonizing Quagmire in increasingly petty and complex ways, like scamming him out of money or sabotaging his relationships. The feud between them became a recurring storyline that took up more and more screen time, with Brian being even more of a jerk than Quagmire in most of their confrontations. Then came the moment that shook the entire fan base. In Season 12, the episode Life of Brian aired, and in it, Brian is hit by a car and dies. The show treated it as a serious, emotional event. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie was devastated. A new dog named Vinny was brought in to replace Brian. Fans were stunned. Some were genuinely heartbroken. Others were furious. The death of Brian Griffin made national headlines and trended on social media for days. It was one of the most talked about moments in the show's history. But here is the part that made people really angry. Just 2 episodes later, in the episode Christmas Guy, Stewie uses a stolen time travel device to go back in time and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian comes back to life. Everything goes back to normal. The whole thing, Brian's death, the grief, the new dog, all of it was undone in less than a month. Fans and critics widely saw this as a cheap ratings stunt. The show had killed off one of its most important characters, not because it served the story, but because it would get people talking and watching. And when they brought him back almost immediately, it confirmed that the death was never meant to be meaningful. It was just a trick to boost the numbers for a few weeks. After his return, Brian somehow got even worse. The traits that Quagmire had called out years earlier became even more extreme. His selfishness reached new levels. In Brian the Closer, Quagmire actually helps Brian by paying for an operation to give him new teeth after an injury. Brian repays this kindness by tricking Quagmire into buying a terrible, run-down property. In Boys and Squirrels, Brian violently kills a baby squirrel that Chris and Stewie had been trying to save from an endangered family of squirrels, and he faces no consequences for it at all. In another episode, Brian has a relationship with a robot duplicate of himself. The character had gone so far off the rails that the writers seemed to have no idea what to do with him other than make him do increasingly outrageous and horrible things. The saddest part of all of this is that you can still see flashes of the old Brian from time to time. There are episodes scattered throughout the later seasons where Brian acts more like his original self. He shows genuine care for Stewie. He offers thoughtful advice. He does something selfless. These moments prove that the writers know who Brian is supposed to be. They remember the character they created. But those moments are rare, and they are always followed by episodes where Brian goes right back to being the worst version of himself. It is like the show cannot decide whether Brian is a good person with flaws or a bad person who occasionally pretends to be good. Brian was likable in those first 8 seasons. That is not just fan opinion. That is the general agreement among people who have watched the show from the beginning. He was the character you wanted to succeed. He was the one you identified with. Watching him turn into someone selfish, pretentious, cruel, and completely lacking in self-awareness was not just disappointing, it was heartbreaking. Because unlike Peter, whose stupidity always kept him at a distance from the audience, Brian was the character who felt the most real. When he changed, it felt personal. It felt like losing a friend. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And Brian is not the only character whose identity was stripped away and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Because while Peter got meaner and Brian got more insufferable, another member of the Griffin family was going through an identity crisis of his own. A baby genius who once had plans to conquer the entire world was slowly losing everything that made him special, and the show has never quite figured out what to replace it with. Section 6. The Stewie Problem. Losing the Evil Genius. Every great television show has that one character who makes it stand out from everything else. The character that people remember even if they have never watched a single full episode. The character that gets quoted, gets turned into Halloween costumes, gets printed on t-shirts, and becomes part of the culture in a way that goes beyond just being on a TV show. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that character was Stewie Griffin. He was unlike anything else on television. A baby, barely 1-year-old, who spoke with a refined British accent, built advanced weapons and machines in his bedroom, plotted to take over the entire world, and spent most of his time trying to murder his own mother. He was hilarious, terrifying, brilliant, and absurd all at the same time. and the show slowly took all of that away from him. To understand what made early Stewie so special, you have to think about what was actually happening on screen when the show first started. In Season 1, Stewie was introduced as an evil genius. That was not a side trait or an occasional joke. That was his entire identity. Almost every scene with Stewie in the first season involved him either building something dangerous, scheming about world domination, or trying to find new ways to kill Lois. He built ray guns, he built mind control devices, he constructed machines that could alter the weather. He spoke in a way that was sophisticated and menacing, like a Bond villain trapped in the body of an infant. The comedy came from the contrast. Here was this tiny baby in a yellow shirt and a diaper, sitting in a high chair, eating baby food, and calmly discussing his plans to enslave all of humanity. The gap between what he looked like and what he was saying was the joke. And it never got old because the writers kept finding new and creative ways to play with that contrast. His obsession with killing Lois was one of the most consistent running jokes in those early seasons. Nearly every episode had at least one moment where Stewie would either attempt to harm Lois or make a comment about wanting her dead. Sometimes these were big, elaborate plans with complicated machines. Sometimes they were small, quick moments, like Stewie casually mentioning that he wanted to destroy her while she fed him his dinner. The beauty of this joke was that Lois never knew. She had no idea that her baby was plotting against her. She would pick him up, hug him, change his diaper, and have absolutely no clue that the child in her arms was fantasizing about her destruction. That dramatic irony, where the audience knows something the character does not, made every interaction between Stewie and Lois both funny and a little bit tense. Another important part of early Stewie was that most of the other characters could not understand him. The adults in the show mostly treated Stewie like a normal baby. They heard him babbling, not the elaborate speeches that the audience heard. This created a whole layer of comedy where Stewie would deliver these grand, dramatic monologues about his plans for domination, and the person standing right next to him would just smile and hand him a bottle. Brian was one of the few characters who could actually understand what Stewie was saying and have real conversations with him, which is a big part of why their friendship eventually became so central to the show. During Season 2, things started to shift slightly. Stewie still wanted world domination and still tried to kill Lois, but the writers began adding more moments where he showed a softer, more vulnerable side. There were little glimpses of femininity, small moments where Stewie did things that hinted at a different side of his personality, like worrying about whether his diaper made his rear end look big, or modeling for a pretend fashion shoot. These were minor touches at first, just quick jokes that added some variety to the character. But they were also the earliest seeds of a much bigger change that was coming. By Season 3, the shift became more noticeable. Stewie was still evil, still wanted to take over the world, and still plotted against Lois, but the softer, more emotional side was getting more screen time. He started showing more affection toward Brian. He had moments where he seemed less like a cold-hearted villain and more like a confused, complicated child who was trying to figure out who he was. The world domination plots were still there, but they did not dominate his storylines the way they had in Season 1. The writers were clearly testing the waters, seeing how far they could push Stewie in a new direction, while still keeping the parts that fans loved. Then the show came back from cancellation in 2005, and the transformation accelerated. Season 4 marked a clear turning point for Stewie. The evil genius elements did not disappear entirely, but they became less frequent and less central to his character. The writers, including MacFarlane, had come to a decision that would change the show forever. They felt that the evil baby joke had been taken as far as it could go. They believed they had explored every possible angle of Stewie wanting to kill Lois and take over the world, and that continuing to repeat those same jokes would make the character feel stale. So they made the conscious choice to move Stewie in a different direction. The direction they chose was to lean heavily into Stewie's relationship with Brian, and to explore his emotional and personal identity. From Season 4 onward, Stewie and Brian became the central pairing on the show, replacing the Peter and Brian dynamic that had been so important in the early years. The Road to episodes, which were special adventure episodes featuring Brian and Stewie traveling together, became some of the most popular episodes in the entire series. These episodes worked because the chemistry between the two characters was genuinely entertaining. Stewie's intelligence and Brian's dry wit complemented each other in ways that felt fresh and fun. But the trade-off was significant. As Stewie became more of Brian's adventure buddy, he became less of the unique, terrifying, hilarious villain he had been at the start. The world domination plots were quietly retired. The attempts to kill Lois faded into the background and then mostly disappeared altogether. The weapons and the machines and the elaborate schemes that had defined the character in seasons 1 through 3 showed up less and less often. By season 8 and beyond, Stewie was essentially a completely different character, wearing the same clothes as the original. The new Stewie was not evil. He was emotional, insecure, creative, and often vulnerable. His storylines shifted from building doomsday devices to dealing with personal problems that were more like the problems a teenager would face than the problems a supervillain would face. He had episodes about his identity, about fitting in, about relationships, about jealousy, and about trying to understand who he was. He still had his time machine, and it still showed up occasionally, but it was used more as a plot device for Brian and Stewie adventures than as part of any grand scheme. The character who once monologued about crushing civilization under his tiny fist was now more likely to be found having a heart-to-heart conversation with Brian about his feelings. The show also increasingly explored Stewie's sexuality in the later seasons. From season 4 onward, Stewie began displaying much more openly effeminate behavior. He started cross-dressing on a regular basis. He made frequent references and jokes about being attracted to men. He went on dates with other characters while dressed as a girl. The show dropped hints about his sexuality in nearly every episode he appeared in. This became such a dominant part of his characterization that for many viewers, Stewie went from being defined by his evil genius to being defined almost entirely by jokes about his sexuality and gender expression. Whether or not you think this direction was a good choice for the character, it is impossible to deny that it represented a massive shift from who Stewie was at the beginning. The season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, is often pointed to as the unofficial farewell to the original version of the character. In these episodes, Stewie finally achieves what he had been trying to do since the very first episode. He kills Lois, takes over the world, and becomes the dictator he always wanted to be. It is a thrilling, dramatic, and darkly funny pair of episodes that gives the audience everything they had been waiting to see from Stewie for years. But then, the twist comes. It was all a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. And after that, the show never really went back to the evil Stewie in any serious way. Those episodes were the last big hurrah for the version of Stewie that fans had fallen in love with, and the show knew it. Now, it is important to be fair here. Not every fan hated the change. Some people genuinely preferred the newer, softer version of Stewie. His friendship with Brian gave the show some of its best emotional moments. Episodes like Christmas Guy, where Stewie uses time travel to save Brian's life after his death in season 12, showed a depth of love and loyalty that the evil baby version of Stewie could never have expressed. The new Stewie was capable of warmth, of sacrifice, of real friendship. He had what you could call an actual character arc, going from a one-dimensional villain to someone much more complex and layered. MacFarlane and the writers would argue that this is growth, not decline. And to some extent, they have a point. But the counter-argument is equally strong. What the show gained in emotional range, it lost in originality. There are hundreds of animated characters who are insecure, emotional, and searching for their identity. There are dozens of cartoon buddy pairings where two mismatched characters go on adventures together. Those stories are fine, and they can be very entertaining. But there was only one evil genius baby who built laser guns in his crib and tried to murder his mother between naps. That character was one of a kind. He was the single most original creation on the show, and the writers retired him because they ran out of ideas for him, which is a very different thing from the character actually running his course. The argument that the evil baby joke had been exhausted does not hold up when you look at how long the show has been running with the replacement version. Family Guy has now produced far more seasons with soft Stewie than it ever did with evil Stewie. If the writers could find enough material to keep the gentler version of Stewie going for over 15 seasons, it is hard to believe they could not have found more to do with one of the most creative and unique character concepts in animation history. The evil genius baby was not a joke that had one punchline. It was a concept that could have been taken in countless directions. New inventions, new schemes, new targets beyond just Lois, new allies, new enemies. The possibilities were enormous, and the writers chose to walk away from all of them. The result is that Stewie, while still entertaining in individual episodes, lost the thing that made him irreplaceable. In season 23, the show continued exploring different sides of Stewie, including his role in various movie parody episodes and his interactions with other characters. There were still funny moments. There were still episodes where Stewie shined. But the character who appears on screen today, while competent and occasionally brilliant, does not leave the same mark on you that the original Stewie did. The original Stewie was dangerous. He was unpredictable. Every scene with him carried a charge of energy because you never knew what insane thing he was going to do or say next. The current Stewie is pleasant. He is likable. He is safe. And for a character who is built on being the exact opposite of safe, that is the biggest loss of all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 major characters now fundamentally altered from who they were at the start. Peter turned cruel. Brian turned insufferable. Stewie lost his edge. But there is one more member of the Griffin family whose treatment by the show might be the most disturbing change of all. A character who went from being an ordinary, relatable teenager to becoming the target of some of the most vicious, sustained, and deeply uncomfortable abuse in the history of animated comedy. Section 7. Meg as a punching bag. The joke that went too far. Every long-running comedy show has a character who gets picked on more than everyone else. It is a common setup. You take one person in the group and make them the target of jokes from the other characters. When it is done well, it can be really funny. When it is done poorly, it just feels mean. And when it is done the way Family Guy did it with Meg Griffin, it goes so far beyond mean that it loops around into something genuinely uncomfortable to watch. The treatment of Meg over the course of this show is not just a case of a joke going too far. It is a case of a joke replacing an actual character. The writers took a normal, relatable teenage girl and turned her into nothing more than a punching bag. And then they kept hitting her for over a decade straight. In Season 1, Meg Griffin was voiced by actress Lacey Chabert. Starting from Season 2, Mila Kunis took over the role and has voiced Meg ever since. In those earliest episodes, Meg was a pretty straightforward character. She was Peter and Lois's oldest daughter. She was a teenager at James Woods Regional High School. She was unpopular. She was not one of the cool kids. She did not have a huge circle of friends. She was kind of boring compared to the rest of her family, which was actually the point. When you have a father who is a reckless idiot, a mother who is somehow holding everything together, a brother who is awkward and clueless, a baby who is secretly an evil genius, and a talking dog, the normal teenage girl is going to seem dull by comparison, and that contrast was the joke. Meg was the ordinary one in an extraordinary family, and the humor came from how out of place her normalcy felt. In those first 3 seasons, the teasing that Meg received was mild. Peter would sometimes say something insensitive to her. Kids at school would make fun of her. She would try to fit in and fail. But none of it was vicious. It was the kind of stuff that happens to a lot of teenagers. Exaggerated slightly for comedy, but still grounded in something real. Peter was not a great father to Meg, but he was not a monster either. He ignored her sometimes. He said dumb things without realizing they were hurtful. But there were also moments where he showed that he cared about her. The family as a whole did not despise Meg. They just did not pay as much attention to her as she wanted, which is a pretty universal experience for teenage girls in big, chaotic families. The first major shift happened around Season 4, after the show came back from cancellation. This is when the jokes about Meg stopped being about her being boring or unpopular, and started being about her being ugly. The writers began making Meg's physical appearance a central target of the humor. Characters would openly comment on how unattractive she was. They would recoil from her. They would make gagging noises when she entered a room. This was a significant change because it moved the jokes from something Meg could theoretically change, like being more interesting or more confident, to something she had no control over. You cannot change how you look. Making fun of a character for being boring is one kind of comedy. Making fun of a character for existing in the body they were born with is a much crueler kind of comedy. And the show jumped into it with both feet. As the seasons continued, the abuse escalated dramatically. By the time you get to seasons 8 through 14, the treatment of Meg had become one of the defining features of the entire show. Peter, who in the early seasons was just an inattentive father, had become actively abusive toward his own daughter. He would fart in her face as a form of entertainment. He would physically shove her. He would make comments about wishing she did not exist. In one episode, a flashback reveals that Peter and Lois tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was still a baby. That scene is presented as a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh at the idea that Meg's own parents wanted to throw her away before she could even walk. In another episode, Peter goes undercover at Meg's high school and ends up ditching her for her rival, choosing popularity over his own daughter. It was not just Peter. The entire family got in on it. Lois, who in the early seasons was the reasonable, caring mother, started treating Meg with open coldness and contempt. Chris, who used to have a normal sibling relationship with Meg, began joining in on the insults. Even Stewie, who in the original seasons barely interacted with Meg at all, started throwing casual cruelty her way. The entire household became united in one thing, and that was treating Meg like she was worthless. It was not just occasional jabs here and there, it was constant, relentless, and it got worse with every passing season. The show also escalated how the outside world treated Meg. At school, the bullying became extreme. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's main rival, was consistently cruel to her. Teachers ignored her or mistreated her. Random strangers would insult her for no reason. The entire town of Quahog seemed to have agreed that Meg Griffin deserved to be treated terribly, and nobody ever questioned it or tried to stop it. The message the show was sending, whether it intended to or not, was that some people just deserve to be mistreated, and the correct response is to laugh at their suffering. The real-world impact of this became so strong that even Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, experienced it personally. Kunis has talked publicly about how people would come up to her and say the catchphrase that became synonymous with Meg's abuse on the show. Peter's dismissive line directed at Meg became something that real people would say to the real woman who gave the character her voice. The fictional cruelty had bled into reality. The single most controversial episode in this entire storyline is the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. This is the episode that made a lot of fans genuinely angry, not because of what happened during the episode, but because of how it ended. In this episode, the Griffin family is stuck in the house during a hurricane. Meg, after years and years of accumulated abuse, finally snaps. She stands up to her family and tells them exactly what she thinks of them. She calls out Peter for being a terrible father. She calls out Lois for being a bad mother. She tells them how their treatment of her has affected her entire life. It is a raw, emotional, powerful moment. For fans who had been watching Meg get destroyed season after season, it felt like justice. It felt like the show was finally acknowledging that the way this character had been treated was wrong, and that she deserved better. But then the episode takes a turn that nobody expected. After Meg's outburst, the rest of the family starts falling apart. Without Meg to serve as their target, Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian turn on each other. The family dynamic collapses because they no longer have a shared person to dump their frustrations on. And the episode ends with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily taking back everything she said. She accepts that her role in the family is to be the one that everyone picks on. She agrees to go back to being the punching bag, because without her absorbing all the abuse, the family cannot function. The message of that episode is deeply troubling when you think about it. It tells the audience that victims of abuse should accept their role because their suffering keeps things stable for everyone else. It says that standing up for yourself is selfish because it disrupts the people who were hurting you. It says that the correct response to years of mistreatment is to quietly go back to being mistreated so that nobody else has to deal with the consequences. Whether the writers intended to send that message or not, that is what the episode communicates. And fans were furious about it. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst and most hated episodes in the entire series, not because it was poorly made, but because of what it chose to say about a character who deserved so much better. What makes the whole Meg situation even more frustrating is that the show has proven, multiple times, that it knows how to write her well. There are episodes scattered throughout the later seasons where Meg is treated like an actual character rather than a target. In the Simpsons crossover episode from season 13, Meg meets Lisa Simpson, who encourages her and tells her that she matters. Lisa helps Meg discover that she has a talent for playing the saxophone, and the two of them become genuine friends. It is a warm, positive, well-written storyline that shows what Meg could be if the writers cared enough to develop her. In the episode Peter's Sister, which aired in season 14, the show actually tries to explain why Peter treats Meg so badly. It is revealed that Peter's own sister physically and emotionally abused him when they were growing up, and that this cycle of abuse is part of what turned Peter into the kind of father who mistreats his own daughter. Meg learns about this, and she and Peter have a genuine emotional reconciliation. Peter acknowledges that he has been terrible to her. Meg shows compassion and understanding. It is a really strong episode that gives both characters real depth and suggests that maybe things could actually change. But they do not change. The very next episodes go right back to the same old routine. Peter insults Meg, the family piles on, the abuse continues as if the reconciliation never happened. This is one of the most damaging patterns in the entire show. It is not that Family Guy cannot write meaningful character moments. It is that it refuses to let those moments stick. Every time the show takes a step forward with Meg, it takes 2 steps back the following week. The reset button gets hit, and we are right back where we started, with Meg at the bottom of the pile and everyone else standing on top of her. Now, to be fair, the show did eventually start to pull back. Around season 14 and into season 15, the Meg abuse began to decrease. Peter, Stewie, and Chris reconciled with Meg to some degree, and the writers started giving her more storylines where she was not just the victim. By season 22, the extreme abuse had largely stopped, which has been partly credited to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the constant cruelty toward the show's main female teenager. Meg started getting episodes where she was competent, tough, and even cool. She began fighting back against bullies instead of just taking it. She showed resilience and strength that the earlier post-revival seasons never allowed her to have. But the damage had already been done. For roughly 10 seasons, from season 4 through season 14, Meg Griffin was defined almost entirely by her suffering. She was not a character, she was a punchline. And the punchline was always the same. Meg is ugly. Meg is unwanted. Meg deserves to be hurt. When you repeat that joke hundreds of times across hundreds of episodes, it stops being a joke and starts being something else entirely. It starts being the show telling you what it thinks about this character, and what it thinks is that she does not matter. The irony is that Meg might actually be the most sympathetic and the most human character on the entire show. She is a teenage girl who just wants to be loved and accepted. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants friends who care about her. She wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. Those are some of the most basic, universal desires that any person can have, and the show punished her relentlessly for having them. In a strange way, Meg's storyline is the clearest proof of Family Guy's decline. A show that once had heart, that once cared about its characters, turned one of its main cast members into nothing more than a target for abuse and called it comedy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 characters now. Peter turned into a bully. Brian turned into a fraud. Stewie lost his edge. Meg became a punching bag. Every major member of the Griffin family has been fundamentally damaged by the choices the writers made over the years. But character problems are only one part of the story, because while the people on the show were getting worse, the way the show told jokes was changing too. And nothing represents that change more clearly than the evolution of Family Guy's most famous comedy tool, the Cutaway gag, which went from being the show's greatest strength to becoming the biggest symbol of its creative laziness. Section 8. Cutaway gags. From clever comedy to a writing crutch. If you have ever watched even a single episode of Family Guy, you know what a cutaway gag is. A character says something like, "This is worse than the time I," or "This reminds me of when," and then the screen cuts to a completely different scene, showing some random, usually ridiculous, situation. The scene plays out for a few seconds, sometimes longer, and then it cuts back to the main story as if nothing happened. That is a cutaway gag. It is the thing that Family Guy is most famous for. It is the comedy tool that defined the show, made it stand out from every other cartoon on television, and turned it into one of the most viral programs in the history of the internet. It is also the thing that, over time, went from being the show's secret weapon to being the clearest sign that the writers had stopped trying. Cutaway gags were part of Family Guy from the very beginning. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, which aired on January 31st, 1999, featured cutaways. The format was baked into the show's identity from day one. MacFarlane and the original writing team used cutaways as a way to pack extra jokes into each episode. The main story would be running along, and then a character would reference something, and the show would quickly jump to a visual gag before jumping back. It It was like getting a bonus joke in the middle of a scene. The storytelling did not stop for the cutaway. The cutaway just added a little something extra on top of what was already happening. In those first 3 seasons, the cutaways had a few qualities that made them work really well. First, they were short. Most of them lasted just a few seconds. They got in, delivered the joke, and got out before the audience had time to lose track of the main story. Second, they were actually clever. The humor in the early cutaways came from unexpected connections, absurd situations, and sharp writing. A character might compare a situation to something completely ridiculous, and the cutaway would show that ridiculous thing in a way that was funnier than you expected. Third, and most importantly, the cutaways were not the only source of humor in the episode. The main story was funny on its own. The character interactions were funny. The dialogue was funny. The cutaways were the cherry on top of an already good piece of comedy. You could have removed every cutaway from a season 1 episode and still had a funny, well-written show. The cutaways enhanced the comedy. They did not carry it. This is the part that changed as the show went on. Starting with the revival in season 4 and getting progressively worse through seasons 5, 6, 7, and beyond, the cutaways began to take over. They got longer, they got more frequent, and most importantly, they started to replace actual storytelling rather than adding to it. Instead of the cutaways being a bonus on top of a solid plot, the plot started to feel like it existed only to connect one cutaway to the next. Episodes began to feel less like stories and more like collections of random sketches loosely tied together by whatever the characters happened to be doing that week. The main storyline got thinner and less interesting because the writers knew they could fill the time with cutaways instead of with actual plot development. The structure of a typical later season episode tells you everything you need to know. A scene would start, characters would have a brief conversation, someone would say a setup line. The show would cut away to a random gag. The gag would play out. The show would cut back. Another brief conversation. Another setup line. Another cutaway. Over and over and over again for the entire episode. Some later episodes have so many cutaways packed into them that if you removed all of them, you would be left with maybe 10 minutes of actual story in a 22-minute episode. The cutaways were not supporting the story anymore, they were the story. And that is a problem, because cutaways by their very nature have nothing to do with what is actually happening on the show. They are random, they are disconnected, they do not advance the plot or develop the characters. When they take over the episode, the plot and the characters suffer. South Park. The long-running animated comedy that has always had a rivalry with Family Guy made this exact criticism in their 2-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006. In those episodes, South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone directly attacked Family Guy's writing style. The episodes depicted Family Guy's jokes as being written by manatees randomly pushing idea balls together, suggesting that the comedy was completely random and required no actual skill or thought to produce. The punchline was that you could replace any cutaway with any other cutaway, and it would not matter because none of them connected to anything. Parker and Stone have been open about their feelings toward Family Guy. They have stated publicly that they do not respect the show's writing. And after those South Park episodes aired, Parker and Stone reportedly received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill, thanking them for making those episodes. Now, you can argue about whether South Park's criticism was fair, or whether it came from a place of genuine creative disagreement, or just rivalry between competing shows, but the core point they were making about the cutaways was hard to argue with, especially as the later seasons proved them more and more right. The early cutaways were clever because someone sat down and wrote a specific joke for a specific moment. The later cutaways often felt like they could have been placed anywhere in any episode and nothing would have changed. They were interchangeable in a way that the early ones were not. One of the most notorious examples of cutaway abuse in the show's history is the Conway Twitty gag. This is a running bit that appeared multiple times across several seasons where, instead of an actual joke, the show would simply cut to a full performance of country singer Conway Twitty singing one of his songs. Not a short clip, not a quick reference, a full, unedited performance that would last for an extended period of time while the audience sat there waiting for it to end. There was no punchline. There was no twist. The gag was simply that the show was playing a Conway Twitty song instead of doing comedy. Some people found it funny the first time because of how unexpected it was. By the third and fourth time, it was widely considered one of the laziest things ever broadcast on television. Fans watching on cable had no choice but to either sit through it or change the channel. It was the writers essentially saying, "We do not have enough material to fill this episode, so here is a country song instead." The Conway Twitty gag became a symbol of everything critics disliked about the later seasons of Family Guy. It represented a show that was more interested in filling time than in creating quality comedy. It represented writers who had run out of ideas and were using the cutaway format as a crutch to avoid having to come up with actual jokes. And it represented a fundamental shift in the show's attitude toward its own audience. The early seasons of Family Guy treated viewers with respect. The jokes were written for people who were paying attention. The later seasons sometimes felt like the show was daring the audience to keep watching, even when it was not giving them anything worth watching. The cutaway problem was made worse by another trend in the later seasons, which was the tendency to drag jokes out far past the point where they were funny. In the early seasons, if a physical gag or a visual joke appeared, it would last a few seconds. It made its point and moved on. In the later seasons, the writers started stretching these moments out for uncomfortably long periods of time. A scene of Peter hurting his knee and sitting on the ground holding it in pain, which should have been a 5-second gag at most, would go on for 30 or 40 seconds of just Peter making the same noise over and over again. A cutaway about a character struggling with plastic wrap in the kitchen would pass the 1-minute mark with the same joke repeating itself. The idea seemed to be that if you took a joke that was funny for 5 seconds and stretched it out to 60 seconds, it would become funny again through sheer commitment. Sometimes this worked. Most of the time, it just felt like the writers were padding the episode because they did not have enough material. The show was actually aware that its cutaway dependency had become a problem, and it tried to address it in the most Family Guy way possible, by making jokes about it. In the episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of the show. While they are there, they observe the characters from the pilot standing around awkwardly during a cutaway, just waiting in silence for it to finish. The joke is that the characters have nothing to do during these gags except stand there. It is a funny meta moment, but it also accidentally highlights the exact problem critics have been pointing out for years. The cutaways take the characters out of the story and leave them with nothing to do. The show even created an entire episode built around the cutaway concept. In the episode Cutaway Land, Peter and Lois discover they can travel between cutaways, jumping from one gag to another as if the cutaway world were a real place they could visit. It was the show's attempt at being clever and self-aware about its most famous feature. But the episode ended up using recycled cutaways from earlier seasons, which made it feel even lazier than a normal episode. And it concluded with Peter waking up and realizing the whole thing was just a dream, which is one of the oldest and most tired endings in all of storytelling. The episode that was supposed to be the ultimate celebration of Family Guy's signature comedy tool ended up being a perfect example of everything that had gone wrong with it. What makes this entire situation so frustrating is that when the show does commit to actual storytelling without relying on cutaways, it can still be excellent. The Season 8 episode, Brian and Stewie, is one of the most praised episodes in the entire series. In this episode, Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode just talking to each other. There are no cutaways. There are no random gags. It is just two characters having real, honest, sometimes painful conversations about their lives, their friendship, and their deepest fears. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him. It is raw, emotional, and completely unlike anything else the show has ever done. And it proves that Family Guy does not need cutaways to be compelling. It just needs good writing and well-developed characters. But episodes like that are the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of later Family Guy episodes lean heavily on cutaways as their primary source of comedy. The storylines are thin, the character development is minimal. The episodes exist as delivery systems for random jokes, rather than as complete, satisfying pieces of entertainment. You can watch a later episode of Family Guy and laugh at individual moments without being able to remember a single thing about the actual plot 5 minutes after it ends. That is the cutaway problem in a nutshell. The show became a highlights reel instead of a show. Fans have noticed this shift and have been vocal about it for years. Online discussions about Family Guy are filled with people comparing the older episodes favorably to the newer ones, specifically because the older episodes had stronger stories. People point out that in the early seasons, you could watch an episode from start to finish and be invested in what happened to the characters. In the later seasons, the only reason to watch is the hope that one of the random cutaways will be funny enough to justify sitting through the rest of the episode. The cutaways went from being the thing that enhanced the show to being the only thing keeping people from turning it off entirely. The connection between the cutaway overload and the character problems discussed earlier is also worth noting. When a show spends most of its time on disconnected random jokes, there is less time to develop characters. There is less time for meaningful dialogue. There is less time for the family to have real interactions that show who they are and how they feel about each other. The warmth that the early show had, the sense that the Griffins were a real family who loved each other despite their flaws, cannot exist in a show that spends half its runtime cutting away to unrelated gags. The cutaways did not just replace the comedy, they replaced the heart. And once the heart was gone, there was nothing left to make the audience care about what happened to these characters. Looking at the cutaway problem from a distance, it becomes clear that it was both a symptom and a cause of Family Guy's decline. It was a symptom because the increasing reliance on cutaways reflected a writing room that was struggling to generate strong, character-driven stories after so many seasons. And it was a cause because the more the show leaned on cutaways, the less it developed the skills and habits needed to tell those kinds of stories. It was a cycle that fed on itself, and the show never found a way to break out of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Characters that used to feel real were now hollow. Jokes that used to feel clever were now random. Stories that used to have heart were now just scaffolding to hold up the next cutaway. And behind all of these problems, there was one massive factor that nobody could ignore. The man who created this show, the man whose vision and passion and talent brought Family Guy to life in the first place, had quietly stepped away from the wheel and left someone else to steer the ship into waters he never would have chosen. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane steps back. The creator leaves his creation. There is a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of television. A creative person builds something special. They pour their heart and soul into it. They guide it through its early years when every decision matters and every detail needs personal attention. The show becomes a hit. It becomes bigger than one person can manage. Other projects start calling. Other opportunities appear. And slowly, bit by bit, the creator steps away from the thing they built. They are still attached to it in name, they still get credit, they still cash the checks, but the day-to-day work, the writing, the story decisions, the creative direction, all of that gets handed off to other people. And the show starts to change in ways that the creator might never have chosen if they were still in the room. This is exactly what happened with Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy, and it is one of the single biggest reasons the show declined. In the early years of Family Guy, MacFarlane was everywhere. He was not just the creator. He was not just the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was deeply involved in the writing, the animation decisions, and the overall creative vision of the show. When you watched a Season 1 or Season 2 episode, you were watching something that had passed through MacFarlane's hands at every stage. He had opinions about the jokes, he had opinions about the stories, he had opinions about how the characters should behave and what the show should feel like. That level of personal involvement is what gave the early seasons their specific identity. There was a clear creative voice guiding everything, and that voice belonged to MacFarlane. The original writing team that MacFarlane assembled included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers worked closely with MacFarlane to establish the tone, the humor, and the character dynamics that made Family Guy what it was. But the show's rocky early history, being canceled twice and then brought back, meant that this original team did not stay together. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this when he pointed out that one consequence of the show constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to bring in new writers. Each cancellation scattered the writing staff. When the show came back, new people had to be hired, and those new people brought different sensibilities and different ideas about what Family Guy should be. But the biggest change was not the writing staff. It was MacFarlane himself. Around 2011, MacFarlane made the decision to step away from an active creative role on Family Guy. He did not quit the show entirely. He continued to voice his characters, which meant he was still in the recording booth doing the voices of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire for every single episode. But the writing, the story planning, the creative oversight, all of that was handed off to other people. The showrunning duties went to Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin, who took over the day-to-day management of the show while MacFarlane focused his energy on other projects. And there were a lot of other projects. MacFarlane had become one of the biggest names in entertainment, and he had ambitions that went far beyond animated television. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the 2012 movie Ted, a comedy about a man whose childhood teddy bear came to life. Ted was a massive hit, earning over $500 million worldwide. He followed that up with the 2014 Western comedy A Million Ways to Die in the West, which he also wrote, directed, and starred in. Then came Ted 2 in 2015. He created and starred in the science fiction television series The Orville, which premiered in 2017 on Fox before moving to Hulu. He produced a live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock that launched in 2024. He was also a well-known singer, releasing multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. MacFarlane was not a guy who was sitting around with nothing to do. He was one of the busiest people in Hollywood, and Family Guy was just one item on a very long list. There is nothing wrong with a creative person pursuing new opportunities. MacFarlane had every right to explore other projects and expand his career beyond the show that made him famous. But the impact on Family Guy was significant and undeniable. When the creator of a show steps away from the creative process, the show loses the one person who understood it better than anyone else. MacFarlane knew why the early seasons worked. He knew the right balance between heart and humor. He knew how far to push the characters and when to pull them back. He knew when a joke was too mean, too long, or too random. Without him actively making those decisions, the show drifted. The showrunners who replaced MacFarlane in the creative driver's seat were competent professionals. Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin had both been with the show for years and knew the world of Family Guy inside and out. But there is a difference between knowing a show and having the vision that created it. A showrunner who inherited the show is going to make different choices than the person who built it from scratch. They might push the humor in directions that MacFarlane would not have. They might let character changes go further than MacFarlane would have allowed. They might not have the same instinct for when something crosses the line from funny to uncomfortable. The show did not have a bad captain. It just did not have its original captain, and you could feel the difference. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox also became a factor in the show's trajectory. For years, there had been tension between MacFarlane and the network. MacFarlane is a politically liberal person who has been outspoken about his views. Fox, the broadcast network, is connected to Fox News through their shared history, and MacFarlane was increasingly uncomfortable with that association. In 2021, he publicly posted on social media that Fox News host Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, saying the two sides both knew it was not working anymore. This was not a private frustration. This was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows, publicly saying he wanted out. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a massive deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. This deal moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, away from the Fox ecosystem and into the Comcast family of networks. His newer projects, like The Orville and the Ted series, were being made for platforms that had nothing to do with Fox. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere, and Family Guy was the thing keeping him tied to a network he no longer wanted to be associated with. This dynamic created an unusual situation. The creator of the show did not want it on the network it was airing on. He was contractually obligated to voice the characters, but was not creatively steering the ship. He had publicly expressed frustration with the network's broader direction. And the show just kept going, season after season, because it was cheap to produce and still generated enough revenue to justify its existence. Family Guy had become a product that continued to be manufactured even after the person who invented it had emotionally moved on. During the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, this dynamic came into sharp focus again. MacFarlane, along with showrunners Appel and Sulkin and American Dad showrunners Brian Boyle and Matt Weitzman, made it clear to the production company 20th Television that none of them would work on their shows while the strike was ongoing. MacFarlane was seen on the picket line supporting the writers, just as he had during the previous strike in 2007 and 2008. His support for the writers was consistent and genuine. But the strike also meant another disruption to Family Guy's production process, another break in the creative flow, another period where the show was in limbo. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview where he discussed the future of Family Guy. He said he did not see a good reason to stop making the show because people still loved it. It made people happy, and it helped fund causes he cared about, like environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He acknowledged that there was a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up, but said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going so long that there was no logical reason to end it, unless the audience stopped caring. He framed the show's continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience demand rather than creative passion. There was no mention of exciting new stories he wanted to tell or creative directions he wanted to explore. The show was continuing because it could, not because its creator had a burning desire to keep making it. This is a very different energy from the MacFarlane who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox back in 1998, bursting with ideas and enthusiasm for this world he had created. That MacFarlane had a vision. He had something to say. He had characters he was excited to develop and stories he was eager to tell. The MacFarlane of 2024 was a man with a dozen other projects on his plate who saw Family Guy primarily as a reliable source of income that could be used for good causes. That is a perfectly reasonable position to take after 25 years, but it explains a lot about why the show feels the way it does in its later seasons. When the creative heart of a show sees it as a financial vehicle rather than an artistic endeavor, the art suffers. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons in what was described as a mega deal with parent company Disney. This renewal would take the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show was not just surviving. It was being locked in for years into the future. Family Guy was going to keep going regardless of whether the creative quality justified its continuation, because the business side of the equation still made sense. And that is really the core of this issue. Family Guy, in its current form, is a show that exists for business reasons more than creative ones. It is cheap to produce compared to live-action shows. It has massive value in reruns and on streaming platforms. It generates merchandise revenue. It is a recognizable brand that can be marketed globally. None of these things have anything to do with whether the show is actually good. A show can be profitable and popular and still be a shadow of what it once was. Family Guy is proof of that. MacFarlane stepping back did not single-handedly ruin the show. The problems with the characters, the cutaways, the humor, and the writing would have developed to some degree even if he had stayed fully involved. 20-plus years of any show will naturally lead to creative fatigue. But his absence removed the one safeguard that might have prevented things from getting as bad as they did. He was the quality control. He was the person who could look at a script and say, "This is not us. This goes too far. This is not funny enough." Without that filter, the show was free to drift in whatever direction the current writing staff wanted to take it. And the direction they chose was not always the right one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The creator stepped away. The characters fell apart. The comedy changed. And all of these problems together produced a result that you can measure in cold, hard numbers. Because while fans and critics can debate about whether the show is still funny or whether the characters are still likable, there is one thing that cannot be debated, and that is what happened to the ratings. Section 10. The rise of shock value over smart writing. There is an important difference between dark humor and shock value. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable or taboo and finds a way to make it funny through clever writing, unexpected twists, and smart observations. Shock value just shows you something extreme and hopes that the extremeness itself is enough to get a reaction. In the early seasons of Family Guy, the show understood this difference perfectly. It pushed boundaries, it went to places that other cartoons would not go, but it did so with intelligence and purpose. The jokes were dark, but they were also well crafted. There was thought behind them. By the later seasons, that thought disappeared. The show stopped trying to be clever about its dark humor, and instead just tried to be as extreme as possible, hoping that the audience would confuse being shocked with being entertained. In seasons 1 through 3, Family Guy had plenty of edgy content. It made jokes about religion, politics, race, and other sensitive topics. It was one of the reasons the Parents Television Council repeatedly placed the show on their list of worst primetime shows for family viewing, doing so in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received multiple complaints and petitions asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting. Family Guy was always a show that provoked strong reactions, but in those early years, the provocative content served a purpose. The jokes were making a point. They were satirizing something. They were using the shock to set up a punchline that was actually funny. The offense was not the joke. The offense was the delivery system for the joke. Compare that to the later seasons, where the show began relying on graphic violence as a primary source of humor. The violence in the early seasons was cartoonish and exaggerated in the way that all animated comedies handle physical comedy. Characters got hurt in silly ways and bounced right back. It was standard cartoon stuff. Nobody took it seriously because it was not meant to be taken seriously. But starting around season 8 and getting worse as the years went on, the violence became much more graphic, much more realistic, and much more disturbing. The show started showing injuries in detail that went far beyond cartoon slapstick. Characters were depicted with exposed brains after being shot. Eyeballs dangled from sockets. People were cut with chainsaws. Children were crushed to death in scenes that were played for laughs. The blood, the injuries, and the suffering were drawn with a level of detail that seemed designed to make the audience wince rather than laugh. Peter Griffin was often at the center of this shift. In the early seasons, Peter's physical comedy involved him falling down, bumping into things, or getting into silly fights with the giant chicken. Those fights were over the top and ridiculous, which is what made them funny. But in the later seasons, Peter became involved in scenes of violence that were genuinely hard to watch. He would inflict serious harm on other characters, sometimes on strangers, and sometimes on his own family, and the show would present it as comedy. The gap between the silly, harmless slapstick of the early years and the graphic cruelty of the later years is enormous. And it happened gradually enough that some viewers did not notice the shift until they went back and watched the old episodes and realized just how different the show had become. The shock value problem went beyond just violence. The show also began leaning heavily on gross-out humor that served no purpose other than to disgust the audience. Entire scenes would be built around bodily functions, graphic medical situations, or disturbing imagery that had no punchline and no point. In the early seasons, the show might include a quick gross-out moment as a small part of a larger joke. In the later seasons, the gross-out moment was the entire joke. The writers seemed to believe that if they could make the audience uncomfortable enough, that discomfort would somehow translate into laughter. Sometimes it did. Most of the time, it just made people want to change the channel. The show's approach to sensitive topics also changed dramatically. Early Family Guy tackled difficult subjects with a certain amount of wit. The jokes about race, gender, disability, and other sensitive areas were wrapped in enough cleverness that even people who were offended could acknowledge that the writing was sharp. Later, Family Guy threw that cleverness out the window. The jokes about sensitive topics became blunter, meaner, and less interested in making a point. Instead of using humor to say something interesting about a difficult subject, the show just pointed at the difficult subject and laughed. The difference between smart satire and lazy offense is huge, and the show crossed that line so many times in its later seasons that it stopped feeling like it was even trying to be satirical anymore. The political commentary followed the same pattern. Family Guy has always included political jokes and references. That is part of what the show does. But in the early seasons, the political humor was relatively balanced and focused on being funny above all else. In the later seasons, the political content became heavier, more one-sided, and more likely to feel dated almost immediately. Episodes that centered around specific political figures or current events from the time they were written aged poorly because the jokes were so tied to that exact moment in time. A great joke is still funny 10 years later. A joke about a specific politician's specific scandal from 2015 is not. The show went from making timeless comedy to making content that had an expiration date built into it. Fourth wall breaking also became a much bigger part of the show's identity in the later years. Breaking the fourth wall means having characters acknowledge that they are on a television show or speak directly to the audience. In the early seasons, this happened rarely, and it was used strategically for a specific comedic effect. In the later seasons, characters broke the fourth wall constantly. Peter would talk directly to the viewers, characters would reference the show's own declining quality, they would make jokes about Fox, about the writers, about the fact that the show had been on for too long. Some fans found this self-awareness funny. Others felt that a show acknowledging its own problems is not the same as fixing them. If anything, the constant fourth wall breaking made things worse because it showed that the people making the show knew it was not as good as it used to be and chose to make jokes about that fact rather than actually do something about it. The overall effect of the shift from smart writing to shock value was that Family Guy lost its identity as a comedy show and became more of a spectacle. People did not tune in to see what clever joke the writers would come up with next. They tuned in to see what outrageous, extreme, or offensive thing the show would do this week. And there is a ceiling on that kind of entertainment. Shock wears off. The first time you see something extreme, it gets a reaction. The 10th time, you are numb to it. The 100th time, you are bored. A show built on cleverness can surprise you forever because there are infinite ways to be clever. A show built on shock can only escalate until it runs out of things to shock you with, and then it has nothing left. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This is where Family Guy found itself by the middle of its run. The clever show that once made audiences laugh because it was smarter than they expected had become a show that made audiences cringe because it was louder and more extreme than they wanted. The writers had traded wit for volume, intelligence for intensity, and craft for chaos. And the audience responded in the most honest way possible. They stopped watching. Because while all of these creative problems were piling up season after season, the one thing that cannot be argued with or explained away was happening in the background. The numbers were dropping. The viewers were leaving. And the data tells a story that is even more damning than anything the critics ever wrote. Section 11. The ratings freefall. Numbers don't lie. You can argue about whether a show is still funny. You can argue about whether the characters are better or worse than they used to be. You can argue about cutaways, about shock value, about writing quality. Those are matters of opinion, and opinions will always vary from person to person. But there is one thing you cannot argue about, and that is numbers. Ratings are not opinions. They are facts. They tell you exactly how many people are watching a show at any given time, and the ratings history of Family Guy tells a story that is impossible to spin in a positive direction. The numbers have been falling for years, and they have fallen so far that the show airing today is watched by a tiny fraction of the audience that once made it one of the biggest programs on television. Let us start at the beginning to understand just how dramatic this drop has been. When Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, the first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers. That is an enormous number. Now, it is fair to point out that any show airing after the Super Bowl is going to get a huge audience, simply because millions of people are already watching. So the Super Bowl boost inflated that first number. But even after that initial spike, the show held strong. The first season averaged 12.8 million households tuning in, which was enough to rank it at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings for that year. For a brand new animated show on Fox, those were very solid numbers. Then came the scheduling problems. Fox moved the show to Thursday nights in its second season, putting it directly against Frasier on NBC, one of the most popular comedies on television at the time. The ratings dropped. Fox moved it again to Tuesday nights, where it got beaten consistently by Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Fox kept shuffling the show around without giving the audience a chance to find it, and the ratings suffered so badly that the show was canceled after its third season in 2002. The cancellation had nothing to do with quality. The show was still good. It was a scheduling problem. Fox sabotaged their own program by refusing to give it a stable home. After 3 years off the air, Family Guy came back in 2005 for its fourth season, riding a wave of hype generated by massive Adult Swim rerun ratings and strong DVD sales. The return was a success. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers, which was impressive for a show that had been dead for 3 years. People were excited to have Family Guy back, and they showed up in big numbers to prove it. But from that high point in 2005, the decline began. It was not sudden, it was gradual. Season after season, the average viewership ticked downward. The drop was slow enough that in any given year, you could explain it away. Maybe the competition was tougher that season. Maybe people were watching online instead of on television. Maybe the time slot was not ideal. There was always an excuse. But when you zoom out and look at the trend over many years, the pattern is unmistakable. The audience was shrinking, and it was shrinking consistently. By season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, the average viewership had dropped to 5.86 million. That is a significant fall from the 7.9 million that season 4 had pulled in less than a decade earlier. The show had lost roughly 2 million viewers in the span of 9 seasons. And the decline did not stop there. It kept going. Season after season, the numbers continued to slide. The drop became even steeper as the show entered its 20s. Season 20 of Family Guy averaged just 1.31 million viewers, with a 0.45 rating in the key adult demographic that advertisers care about most. Think about that for a moment. A show that once pulled in nearly 8 million viewers on its return was now barely holding on to 1.3 million. That is a loss of over 80% of the audience. And it kept getting worse. Season 23 averaged just 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 rating in that same key demographic. Less than 750,000 people were watching new episodes of a show that had once been one of the biggest programs on television. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers was now being watched by fewer people than live in some mid-sized cities. The network's treatment of the show reflected this decline. For most of its run, Family Guy aired on Sunday nights as part of Fox's animation domination lineup. Sunday night was prime real estate. It was the night when the biggest animated comedies on television aired back-to-back, with The Simpsons as the anchor. Family Guy thrived in that environment for years. But things started to shift. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 p.m. slot to the less prominent 9:30 p.m. position. That was the first sign that the network was rethinking Family Guy's place in the lineup. Then came the bigger move. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Fox made a scheduling decision that sent a clear message. Family Guy and fellow longtime animated comedy Bob's Burgers were removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely. Their spots were given to other shows. And when Family Guy returned to the schedule, it was placed on Wednesday nights. This was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since 2002, back when the show was in its original troubled run before its first cancellation. Being moved from Sunday night to Wednesday night is widely understood in the television industry as a demotion. It means the network no longer considers you a headliner. You are being moved to a quieter night where expectations are lower and the audience is smaller. The irony of all this is that Family Guy once made history with its critical reception. In 2009, the show was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was a historic moment because it was the first time an animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones back in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. Not even The Simpsons, the most acclaimed animated comedy in television history, had received that honor. Family Guy did. In 2013, TV Guide ranked the show as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. These achievements speak to a time when Family Guy was taken seriously as a creative force in television. That time feels very far away now. Despite the cratering ratings, the show has continued to be renewed. In January 2023, Fox renewed Family Guy for its 22nd and 23rd seasons. And in April 2025, it was announced that the show had secured a massive renewal deal with parent company Disney, extending the series through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under this new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show was not just surviving, it was being guaranteed years of additional life regardless of the ratings. This might seem confusing. Why would a network keep renewing a show that is losing viewers at this rate? The answer comes down to money. Animated shows are much cheaper to produce than live-action shows. There are no expensive sets to build. There are no large casts of on-screen actors to pay. The voice actors record their lines in a booth. The animation is done overseas. The whole operation is lean and cost-effective compared to most of what airs on network television. On top of that, Family Guy has enormous value outside of its first-run broadcast. It airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It streams on Hulu. It generates merchandise revenue from t-shirts, toys, video games, and countless other products. The money that Family Guy makes does not come primarily from how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. It comes from the entire ecosystem of content that the show has built over 25 years. As long as that ecosystem remains profitable, the show will continue to exist, regardless of whether the creative quality justifies it. And that is perhaps the saddest part of the whole story. Family Guy has become a show that continues to exist not because it is great, but because it is profitable. The audience that once loved it has largely moved on. The ratings prove that beyond any doubt. But the business machine keeps turning because the economics still work. The show is no longer driven by passion or creativity or a desire to make people laugh. It is driven by spreadsheets and licensing deals and the fact that it costs very little to keep producing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But if there is one final piece of evidence that Family Guy has lost its place at the top, it is not the ratings, and it is not the critics, and it is not the fan complaints. It is the fact that another show, a show created by the same man, a show that was once considered a lesser copycat, has quietly and undeniably become the better version of everything Family Guy used to be. Section 12. American Dad did it better. The final insult. If everything we have talked about so far represents the internal problems that brought Family Guy down, this section is about the external proof that those problems were real. Because the single most damaging thing you can say about Family Guy's decline is not that the characters got worse, or that the cutaways took over, or that the ratings collapsed. The most damaging thing you can say is that another show, created by the same person, launched at the same time, and given far less attention and far less hype, ended up becoming the better show. That show is American Dad, and its existence is the ultimate evidence that Family Guy's decline was not inevitable. It was a choice. American Dad premiered on February 6th, 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its 4th season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane, along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed the Smith family, led by Stan Smith, a patriotic, conservative CIA agent living in Langley Falls, Virginia, with his wife Francine, their kids Haley and Steve, a space alien named Roger who lived in their attic, and a German-speaking goldfish named Klaus, who was actually a man whose brain had been placed into a fish's body by the CIA. On paper, it sounded like a weirder version of Family Guy. Another animated family sitcom from the same creator on the same network on the same night. Many people dismissed it immediately as a copycat, a lesser version of the real thing. Family Guy's little brother who would never measure up. And for the first couple of seasons, that criticism was somewhat fair. Early American Dad was finding its footing. The show leaned too heavily on political humor in its first season, with Stan's extreme conservatism being the driving force behind most of the comedy. It felt one note at times, like the writers were not sure what the show was beyond political satire. The ratings were decent, but not spectacular. Critics were lukewarm. Audiences who watched it mostly did so because it aired right after Family Guy on Sunday nights, not because they were specifically seeking it out. Nobody was calling American Dad the better show in 2005. Nobody was even calling it a good show yet. It was just there, filling a slot in the animation domination lineup. But then something happened that nobody expected. American Dad got better. Not just a little better, significantly, consistently, measurably better. While Family Guy was going through all the problems we have discussed throughout this video, the Flanderization, the cutaway overload, the loss of heart, the shock value, American Dad was quietly doing the opposite. It was developing its characters, it was telling better stories, it was finding its identity, and it was doing all of this without the massive hype, the cult following, or the cultural footprint that Family Guy had. American Dad did not need any of that. It just needed to be good, and it was. The key difference between the two shows comes down to one fundamental choice. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. That might sound like a small thing, but it changes everything about how the show works. Without cutaways to fall back on, the writers of American Dad had to make every episode work as an actual story. They could not fill time with random disconnected jokes. They could not use a setup line to jump to an unrelated gag and then jump back. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situations they were in. Every funny moment had to be earned through the plot. This forced the writing staff to be better storytellers, and over time, it produced a show that was simply more satisfying to watch from start to finish. The characters on American Dad also avoided the Flanderization that destroyed the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature, but the writers allowed him to grow. Over the seasons, Stan became a complex character who was stubborn and often wrong, but also genuinely loved his family and was capable of real emotional growth. He made mistakes, and sometimes learned from them. He had episodes where he was the hero and episodes where he was the villain, and both felt natural because the writers had built a character who was complicated enough to be both. Compare that to Peter Griffin, who went from a lovable fool to a cruel maniac with no real development connecting those two versions of the character. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in all of animated television, and he did it through a concept that was endlessly creative. Roger had the ability to adopt different personas, essentially becoming entirely different characters with different names, different personalities, and different backstories. This gave the writers an infinite well of material to draw from. Every episode could feature a new version of Roger, each one more absurd than the last, and it never got stale because the concept was designed to constantly evolve. Compare that to what happened with Stewie, who went from having one of the most original character concepts in animation history to being a softer, safer version of himself with no clear direction. Francine Smith avoided the decline that Lois Griffin suffered. Haley and Steve maintained consistent personalities throughout the show's run. Klaus, the fish, served as the family's punching bag in a way that was actually funny because the character was designed for that role from the start, unlike Meg, who was turned into a punching bag after the fact. The Smith family felt like a real family who genuinely cared about each other, even when they were fighting. The warmth that Family Guy lost after its first few seasons is something that American Dad maintained throughout its entire run. Fans and critics noticed the shift. Over the years, it became an open secret among people who watched both shows that American Dad had surpassed Family Guy in quality. Online discussions, reviews, and rankings consistently placed American Dad above its older sibling. People who had grown tired of Family Guy's declining quality found that American Dad was giving them everything they used to love about MacFarlane's comedy, but in a more consistent and more satisfying package. The show that was once dismissed as a lesser copycat had become the standard that Family Guy was being unfavorably compared to. The irony of this situation is impossible to ignore. American Dad, the show that MacFarlane was less involved with creatively as the years went on, maintained its quality. Family Guy, the show that bore MacFarlane's name more prominently and was supposed to be his flagship creation, fell apart. This suggests that the problem with Family Guy was not just about MacFarlane leaving. It was about the specific creative decisions that were made by the people running the show in his absence. The American Dad writing staff, led for many years by co-creator Matt Weitzman and later by showrunner Brian Boyle, made choices that protected the show's identity and kept the characters grounded. The Family Guy writing staff made choices that prioritized shock, spectacle, and cutaway gags over character and story. Both shows had the same creator. Both shows had talented writers. But one show was managed better than the other, and the results speak for themselves. American Dad also handled its network transitions more gracefully. The show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, a change that could have killed a lesser show. Instead, the move gave the writers more creative freedom, and the show continued to produce quality episodes. It was later renewed and continued to air successfully. Meanwhile, Family Guy clung to Fox despite MacFarlane's public frustrations with the network, and its move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights felt like a slow march toward irrelevance. The American Dad comparison matters because it eliminates the most common excuse people make for Family Guy's decline. The usual argument is that any show will get worse after 20+ years, that creative fatigue is inevitable, that no comedy can stay fresh for that long. And there is some truth to that. But American Dad has been running for roughly the same amount of time and has not suffered the same catastrophic decline. It proves that longevity alone does not doom a show. What dooms a show is the choices that are made along the way. Family Guy chose cutaway dependency. American Dad chose storytelling. Family Guy chose to Flanderize its characters into unrecognizable versions of themselves. American Dad chose to develop its characters while keeping their core identities intact. Family Guy chose shock value over cleverness. American Dad chose to be funny without relying on making the audience uncomfortable. At the end of the day, Family Guy's decline is not a mystery. It is not some unexplainable phenomenon that just happened for no reason. Every single problem the show has can be traced back to specific decisions that were made by specific people over the course of many seasons. The decision to push Peter from lovable to cruel. The decision to turn Brian into a hypocrite. The decision to retire evil Stewie. The decision to make Meg nothing more than a target. The decision to let cutaways replace storytelling. The decision to value shock over wit. The decision to keep the show going long after the creative well had run dry. None of these things had to happen. American Dad proves that. A show can run for decades and still be good if the people in charge care enough to make it good. Family Guy was once one of the greatest animated comedies ever made. It changed television. It influenced an entire generation of comedy. It came back from the dead not once, but twice because people loved it that much. And then slowly, painfully, one bad decision at a time, it became the version of itself that people use as an example of how not to run a television show. The golden years are still there. Seasons 1 through 3 are still brilliant. The early revival seasons still have moments of genius. But the show that airs today, watched by a fraction of its former audience on a night of the week it was never meant to be on, is a reminder that no amount of past greatness can protect you from present mediocrity. Family Guy did not just get worse every season. It chose to get worse every season. And that is the part that hurts the most. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.